Each encounter holds a hidden truth. Every investigation demands clarity. Empowering your legal rights, uncovering pure justice.
Excuse me, what exactly are you doing in this neighborhood?
I'm sorry, what? I'm just walking to my car.
Don't act dumb. This is a private community, and I know you don't belong here.
Ma'am, this is a public street. I live 3 houses down from here.
I'm calling the police. You are way too
You're
suspicious.
free to call whoever you...
It was a quiet Saturday morning in the neighborhood. The kind of morning where the silence of residential streets is only broken by the wind carrying autumn leaves across the sidewalk. Cars sat in driveways, houses were still, and everything had that deceptive appearance of a place where absolutely nothing could go wrong. It was October 14th, 2023, exactly 11:23 in the morning, and a security camera installed near the community mailboxes was recording everything in high definition, with no one around yet understanding the weight that footage would carry in the weeks to come. Diana had just returned from a yoga class. She was in workout clothes, carrying her rolled purple mat tucked under her arm, and was heading to the mailboxes the way she did every week. There was nothing extraordinary about that moment. She lived there, paid her HOA fees on time, and had the key to the box with her own house number engraved on it. She was a resident like any other in that neighborhood. But when a neighbor appeared, a blonde woman in a denim jacket with her arms crossed and an expression that left little room for ambiguity, what should have been an ordinary morning turned into something neither of them would ever forget. The neighbor approached with the posture of someone who had already made up her mind before she even opened her mouth. There was no friendliness, no casual greeting that you'd expect between people who had shared the same neighborhood for months. There was only that tense, accusatory energy, the kind that any black person who has ever lived in a predominantly white space recognizes immediately. It doesn't need to be spoken out loud. It lives in the body, in the gaze, in the way someone treats you as though you need to justify your presence in a particular place simply by existing there. Diana knew that energy. She had felt it before, and she understood in that exact moment that she needed to choose very carefully how she was going to respond. What the neighbor didn't know, and this is the detail that changes everything in this story, is that Diana wasn't just a resident of the neighborhood. Diana was a lawyer, not just any lawyer. She was a specialist in real estate law, a field that deals precisely with property, ownership, housing rights, and everything surrounding the legal space a person has the right to occupy. In other words, the woman being questioned about whether she actually lived there spent her weekdays defending other people's rights to their own properties. The irony was almost impossible to believe. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story gets far more intense than these first few minutes suggest, and you are going to want to stay until the end. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments if you have ever been through something like this. If you have ever been treated as though you didn't belong somewhere, you had every right to be. It could be a neighborhood, a store, a hotel, a restaurant. Tell me down below, because this conversation matters. The security camera kept recording as the two women stood there on the sidewalk near the mailboxes, autumn leaves behind them and the cloudy October sky above. Within minutes, that footage would stop being just a file in a residential monitoring system and become evidence. Evidence of something that happens with alarming frequency in neighborhoods, shopping centers, elevators, and streets across the country, but that is rarely captured with such clarity. And when that video reached the right hands, the life of one of those two women on that sidewalk would never be the same again. Diana grew up understanding that competence was not enough, that diplomas on the wall were not enough, that an address in a good neighborhood was not enough. She had learned this not in a classroom, but through life, through the small daily humiliations that accumulate in silence over the years and shape the way a black person learns to move through the world. She had built her career with an almost stubborn discipline, spent years studying real estate law, built a solid reputation, and bought her home in that neighborhood not by chance, but because she had worked for it with a determination that most people would never need to have. And yet, there she was, on the sidewalk, being questioned. The neighbor who approached that morning was named Susan. She had lived in the neighborhood for several years and had apparently developed over that time a kind of ownership over the surrounding space. The territorial comfort that certain people build without ever realizing it rests on the assumption that some people belong and others do not. Susan was not at least on the surface, what most people would picture when they think of someone racist. She did not shout. She did not use slurs. She simply walked up to a neighbor who was checking her mail and began asking questions in a tone that made clear these were not real questions at all. They were demands dressed up as curiosity. What makes this kind of situation so devastating is not obvious violence. It is exactly the opposite. It is the way everything unfolds in a controlled tone of voice, in language that sounds reasonable on the surface, but carries underneath it an absolutely clear message. Prove that you have the right to be here. This dynamic has a name. Researchers and behavioral specialists call it everyday racism or microaggression. But the technical term fails to capture the real weight of what it is to be on the receiving end of that experience. It is not micro for the person living it. It is exhausting. It is humiliating. And it happens with a frequency that people who have never experienced it simply cannot imagine. Diana stood there listening to Susan's questions with a calm that anyone who knew her would understand came at a cost. She was a lawyer. She spent her days navigating conflicts, negotiations, situations where keeping composure was the difference between winning and losing. But there is an enormous difference between maintaining composure in a conference room or a courtroom, and maintaining composure when someone is treating you like an intruder in the place where you sleep, where you keep your things, where you have the absolute legal right to be. Even so, she did not lose control. She responded. She explained. And at some point during that exchange, she did something Susan certainly did not expect. She made it clear that she knew exactly what her rights were. Have you ever stopped to think about how many times a day Black people have to make that calculation? How far do I go? How much do I explain? When do I stop justifying myself? It is not a simple decision. There are consequences in every direction you choose. If you back down, the situation repeats itself because it went unpunished. If you respond too firmly, you become the problem. If you draw attention to the injustice, you are told you are overreacting, that you are being sensitive, that you are seeing racism where none exists. It is a trap designed to have no exit, and Diana knew every corner of it. What Susan had not calculated, not for a single moment as she stood there with her arms crossed, asking her questions on that October morning, was that the security camera positioned near the mailboxes was capturing everything. Every second of that interaction was being recorded with the date and time stamped in the upper right corner of the frame. And what the camera showed was not an ambiguous situation open to interpretation. What it showed was one woman approaching another in a shared public space, with no legitimate reason, with body language that told a very specific story about what she truly thought about having Diana as a neighbor. That footage was about to become the center of everything. When Diana walked back into her house that morning, she did not go straight to the kitchen to make coffee or turn on the television the way she would have on any other normal Saturday. She sat down. She was quiet for a moment. And then she began to process what had just happened with the analytical mind of someone who spends their professional life dismantling situations and identifying what is truly at stake. She knew that what Susan had done was not just unpleasant, it was potentially illegal, and she knew, with the precision of someone who understands the law from the inside, exactly which paths were available to her in that moment. The first step was to check the security cameras. The neighborhood had a monitoring system in common areas, including the mailbox area, and Diana knew this. She had noticed the cameras before, the way people who pay attention to their surroundings tend to notice these things. When she confirmed that the camera was positioned directly over the location where the conversation had taken place, she understood that she had something concrete. It was not just her word against Susan's word. There was a recording. There was an objective record of that moment, with date, time, and image clear enough to show exactly what had happened and how it had happened. Getting access to that recording was not immediate. It involved contacting the neighborhood association, making a formal request, and navigating the bureaucracy those requests typically entail. But Diana was a lawyer. She knew how to make formal requests. She knew what her rights were as a resident regarding access to recordings from common areas. And she knew that every hour that passed without that file being preserved was an hour in which it could be overwritten or deleted by the system's automatic rotation. She acted with urgency, but with method. No agitation, no confrontation, just the quiet efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. While she waited for the footage, Diana began documenting everything she could. She wrote a detailed account of the conversation, while the memories were still fresh, noting not just what was said, but the tone, the posture, the sequence of events. She photographed the mailbox area. She identified which neighbors might have seen or heard anything. This documentation process might seem excessive to anyone who has never had to prove they were the victim of something that leaves no physical marks. But Diana understood that in situations like this one, where discrimination happens in carefully controlled language and without obvious witnesses, the difference between being able to hold someone accountable or not almost always comes down to the details most people dismiss as irrelevant. The video arrived, and when Diana watched that footage for the first time, sitting in front of her computer with the file finally open on the screen, what she saw confirmed everything she had felt on that sidewalk. The camera had captured Susan's approach with unsettling clarity. You could see the body language, the crossed arms, the expression on her face, the way Susan had positioned herself in relation to Diana in a manner that anyone watching would recognize as confrontational. There was no ambiguity in those images. There was no way to watch that video and conclude that what was taking place was a friendly conversation between neighbors. What was happening there was an interrogation, and the reason for that interrogation was implicit in every second of the recording. Diana sent the video to several professional colleagues that same evening, not to ask for their opinion about what had happened. She already knew what had happened, but to assess, with other trained eyes, what the smartest strategy would be from that point forward. The responses were unanimous. What the footage showed was sufficient to support a formal complaint with the Neighborhood Association for Racial Discrimination, and possibly far more than that. One colleague who watched the video said something that stayed with Diana for days, that Susan had made the classic mistake of people who act on prejudice and have never been held accountable before. She had acted as though there would be no consequences, as though no one was watching, as though the entire world could not see. The formal complaint was filed on a Monday morning, 2 days after the incident. Diana arrived at the Neighborhood Association's management office with a carefully drafted document, the detailed account she had written on Saturday, and a preserved copy of the recording. The person who received her on the other side of the counter clearly had not expected that level of preparation. They had not expected precise legal language, had not expected specific references to the clauses in the neighborhood's internal regulations, prohibiting discrimination among residents, and had definitely not expected the woman sitting across from them to know exactly what the management's legal obligations were from the moment a formal complaint was registered. The meeting was brief, the complaint was accepted, and the clock began to run. The Neighborhood Association contacted Susan that same week. What was said in that conversation was never fully disclosed, but the result was clear. Susan received a formal notification informing her that a complaint had been filed against her for discriminatory conduct, and that the association was obligated to investigate. For Susan, this was likely the first moment in which the seriousness of what she had done began to take any concrete form. Until then, from her perspective, what had happened on that sidewalk was simply a conversation between neighbors. Perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps misinterpreted, but not something with real consequences. The formal notification was the first indication that she had miscalculated badly. Susan hired a lawyer. This detail matters because it reveals something about how she interpreted the situation. She did not go to Diana to apologize. She did not go to the Neighborhood Association to try to resolve the misunderstanding, as she surely would have called it had she had that conversation. She went directly to a lawyer, which means that on some level, she knew she had done something that required a defense. Her attorney began constructing the narrative that was predictable from the start, that Susan was simply being a good neighbor, concerned about the safety of the community, that there had been no discriminatory intent, that everything had been misinterpreted by Diana, and that the formal complaint was a disproportionate reaction to a completely ordinary situation. That defense narrative, the one about the concerned neighbor looking out for community safety, is one of the oldest and most commonly used in cases of racial discrimination in residential communities. It works because it sounds reasonable on the surface. Who could be against neighbors who care about the safety of the place where they live? The problem is that it collapses completely when you ask the right questions. Why was Diana specifically approached and not other residents who were in the area at the same time? Why was the approach immediately confrontational rather than friendly? Why had Susan never approached Diana in this way? Before, during the weeks the two had coexisted in the neighborhood without incident. And most importantly, why was the body language captured in the recording consistent with suspicion and hostility rather than genuine concern? Diana's attorney responded to the defense narrative with something far more powerful than counter-arguments. With evidence. The footage was analyzed frame by frame. Experts in nonverbal behavior were consulted to technically document what anyone watching the video already perceived intuitively. The history of the neighborhood association was researched for other similar incidents, other complaints, other patterns that could contextualize what had happened to Diana, not as an isolated event, but as part of something larger. Every piece of information that Susan's defense presented was found, examined, and answered with surgical precision. Diana was not merely reacting, she was building a case. What was becoming increasingly evident as the process moved forward was that Susan had underestimated Diana in a way that went far beyond that Saturday morning. She had underestimated her knowledge, her determination, and her capacity to transform that humiliating experience into a legal battle that Susan was simply not equipped to win. There is a particular cruelty in discriminating against someone who has dedicated their professional life to understanding and defending the very rights being violated in that exact moment. Susan had chosen, for reasons only she could explain, to confront precisely the wrong person. And now, the consequences of that choice were beginning to take shape in a way that neither of them could ignore. The legal process that followed lasted months, and during those months, Susan's life continued apparently normal on the outside, while on the inside, it was being systematically dismantled by a body of evidence she had no way to refute. Her attorney did what defense lawyers do in these cases, tried to create doubt, tried to recontextualize what the camera had shown, tried to convince the parties involved that all of this was a monumental exaggeration about a trivial conversation between neighbors. But there is a very clear limit to what arguments can accomplish when a high-definition recording exists, showing exactly the opposite of what the defense is trying to sustain. The recording was the center of everything throughout the entire process. It was formally presented, analyzed by experts, and displayed in contexts that Susan had certainly never imagined when she stood there with her arms crossed on that October morning. Every frame of that video told a story that required no narration. The way Susan had approached, the posture she had maintained throughout the conversation, the expression she wore on her face while Diana answered her questions with the exhausted calm of someone who had been through this before. All of it was there, digitally preserved, irrefutable. And the more Susan's attorney tried to find a way to reinterpret those images, the more evident it became that no reinterpretation was possible. What the process also began to reveal, as it moved forward, was a history that made the incident even less isolated than it had already seemed. Other residents of the neighborhood, most of them black or from other minorities, began sharing their own experiences. None of them had ever filed a formal complaint, for reasons that anyone who understands how these dynamics work recognizes immediately. The fear of not being believed, the exhaustion of having to repeatedly prove what you know happened, the feeling that the system was not built to protect you. But when Diana opened that space by filing her complaint and making the process visible, those stories began to emerge, and they painted a picture far broader than a single incident on a Saturday morning. The neighborhood association, which had initially treated Diana's complaint as a bureaucratic problem to be managed, began to realize it was sitting on top of something potentially far more serious. A documented pattern of racial discrimination in the common areas of a residential community is not merely a neighbor relations problem. It is a legal liability. It is the kind of thing that results in lawsuits not just against the individual who practiced the discrimination, but against the entity that manages the space where it happened and that failed to create a safe and equal environment for all its residents. Diana's attorney had made this very clear from the beginning, and now the association was finally taking it seriously. Susan received a settlement offer several weeks before. The case was set to go to trial. The initial figures were rejected by Diana, who was not conducting this process in search of whatever amount would make the problem quietly disappear. She was looking for a number that reflected the true gravity of what had happened, that acknowledged the harm caused, and that was high enough to mean something beyond a passing financial inconvenience. The negotiations were tense. Susan and her attorney repeatedly tried to frame the agreement as an honorable exit for both parties. as though Diana were doing her a favor by agreeing to close the case without going to trial. Diana did not see it that way, and her attorney was absolutely clear about what would happen if the case reached a jury with that recording as the primary evidence. The final number was $50,000. $50,000 that Susan would have to pay Diana as formal acknowledgement of the harm caused by her conduct on that October morning. But the agreement included more than money. It included a series of conditions related to Susan's future behavior within the neighborhood, obligations to participate in racial discrimination awareness programs, and clauses that made any future incident substantially more costly from a legal standpoint. The money was important. The conditions were even more important, because Diana's goal had never been simply to be compensated for what she had suffered. It was to ensure it would not happen again. The agreement was signed on an afternoon in March, 5 months after that October morning, at the mailboxes. Diana was in her attorney's office when she put pen to paper, and the people in the room described the moment as surprisingly quiet. There was no celebration, no dramatic relief, none of those cathartic moments that movies teach you to expect when justice finally happens. There was only the quiet weight of a long process coming to an end, and the awareness that no amount of money and no contractual clause completely erases what was done on that sidewalk on a Saturday morning. Diana gave an interview a few weeks after the agreement was finalized. She spoke with the same calm she had demonstrated throughout the entire process, the same calm that was recorded in that mailbox video, and said something that summarized with precision what had motivated her to see it through to the end. She said that she knew, from the moment she walked back into her house that Saturday, that if she did nothing, Susan would continue doing the same thing to other residents. To people who would not know there was a camera, to people who would not know what their rights were, to people who would not have the resources or the knowledge to fight back. She had fought not just for herself, but for every one of those people the system leaves without options. The video had already circulated among resident groups and civil rights attorneys before the agreement was even finalized. After the outcome became public, it began spreading in a broader way. People shared it not just out of outrage over what Susan had done, but because of what Diana had done in response. The way she had documented everything immediately, preserved the recording, filed the formal complaint, built the case with methodology and patience, and refused insufficient settlement offers until she achieved a result that truly meant something. She had transformed a humiliating experience into a manual for how to defend yourself when the system tends to protect the one who did wrong. Susan virtually disappeared from the social life of the neighborhood after the agreement was signed. Some neighbors reported that she had drastically reduced her interactions with other residents, that she rarely appeared in common areas, and that when she did, she avoided any contact with Diana. Whether she had genuinely reflected on what she had done or had simply learned to be more careful is impossible to know. What can be said with certainty is that the entire neighborhood had changed after that process. The association had revised its internal policies. The residents who had shared their own experiences during the investigation had finally seen their stories taken seriously. And there was a camera at the mailboxes that everyone now knew was recording. There is something deeply revealing in the way this case unfolded from the standpoint of what it says about power and about who has access to it. Susan had acted the way she did because, on some level, she believed she could. Because people in positions like hers generally can and usually face no real consequences. What she had not calculated was the specific combination of factors that made this case different. A camera in the right place, a victim with specialized legal knowledge, and a determination that did not yield when the system offered the easy exit of an insufficient settlement. Remove any one of those elements, and the outcome would likely have been completely different. That is the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. Because the truth this case leaves hanging in the air, after the money was paid and the documents were signed and everyone's lives moved forward, is that justice should not depend on a camera being in the right place. It should not depend on the victim being a specialist attorney in precisely the relevant field. It should not require months of legal proceedings, considerable financial resources, and an extraordinary determination from someone who had already been humiliated enough. It should be accessible to any person who wakes up on a Saturday morning, goes to get their mail, and is treated as though they do not belong in the place where they live. Diana achieved justice. But she was the first to say that the fact that she achieved it does not mean the system is working. It means only that this time, with this unique combination of circumstances, it did not manage to fail.
Fairness is an enduring mission, and insight serves as your safeguard. Thank you for watching and advocating for absolute clarity.